200 warriors stood in perfect silence along his fence line, their painted faces catching the morning light. Not one of them moved. Not one of them spoke. They simply watched Malachi Brooks through his cabin window as he gripped his coffee cup with trembling hands. Yesterday he had been nobody, a virgin rancher who'd never even kissed a woman, let alone understood the customs of the native tribes that roamed these endless plains. Today, he was the center of something he couldn't comprehend, something that had begun with nothing more than his jacket and a woman's grateful smile. The storm had arrived without warning the previous evening, turning the sky black as ink and sending sheets of rain across his isolated homestead. Malachi had been checking his horses in the small corral when he spotted her, a figure stumbling through the downpour, her long black hair plastered to her shoulders, her buckskin dress soaked through. She moved like someone fighting against more than just the weather, each step deliberate but exhausted. He thought nothing of it then, just acted on instinct. "Ma'am, you need shelter," he called out, running toward her through the mud. She turned, and even through the rain he could see her dark eyes were filled with something that looked like fear. Not fear of him, but fear of something else entirely. Something that made her glance repeatedly over her shoulder toward the tree line. "I cannot stay," she said, her voice barely audible above the thunder. Her accent was soft but unfamiliar, each word carefully chosen. "My people will worry." But as lightning split the sky and illuminated her shivering form, Malachi did what his mother had taught him before she died. He showed kindness to a stranger in need. Without hesitation, he pulled off his thick wool jacket, the one his father had worn during harsh winters, and draped it around her shoulders. The moment the jacket settled around her, something changed in her expression. She looked down at the worn leather and faded fabric as if it were made of gold, then back up at his face with an intensity that made his heart race in ways he didn't understand. "You would give this to me?" she whispered. "Just until the storm passes," he replied, feeling heat rise to his cheeks. "You're freezing." She pulled the jacket tighter around herself, and for a moment, they stood there in the rain, two strangers sharing something that felt larger than the simple exchange it appeared to be. Then she smiled, not the polite smile of gratitude he expected, but something deeper, something that seemed to reach into parts of his soul he didn't know existed. "My name is Ayanna," she said. "Malachi Brooks. I will remember this kindness, Malachi Brooks." She disappeared into the darkness before he could offer her his cabin, leaving him standing alone in the storm with questions he couldn't answer. He had no way of knowing that his simple act of compassion had just set in motion events that would change not only his life, but the delicate balance between two worlds. Now, as he stared at the silent army outside his fence, one thought echoed through his mind. What exactly had he done? The sun climbed higher, but the warriors remained motionless. Malachi had been watching them for 3 hours now, his breakfast growing cold on the table, his mind racing through every possible explanation for their presence. They weren't threatening him directly, but their sheer number made his blood run cold. 200 men could overrun his small homestead in minutes if they chose to. He tried to go about his morning routine, feeding the chickens and checking the water trough, but every movement felt watched, examined, judged. The warriors' painted faces tracked his every step, their expressions unreadable. Some carried bows, others held long spears, but none had drawn their weapons. They simply stood there like living statues, creating a human wall that stretched along the entire length of his property line. As the morning wore on, Malachi noticed something that made his stomach tighten with unease. More warriors were arriving. Small groups emerged from the distant hills, their horses moving at a steady pace toward his ranch. By midday, what had started as 200 had grown to nearly 300. They arranged themselves with military precision, filling every gap along his fence until there was no break in their formation. That was when he realized this wasn't random. This wasn't some hunting party that had stumbled upon his land. This was organized, planned, purposeful. But for what? The memory of Ayanna's grateful smile haunted him, the way she had looked at his jacket, as if it meant something far beyond its practical warmth. The careful way she had spoken his name, pronouncing each syllable like it mattered. The intensity in her dark eyes when she promised to remember his kindness. His father had warned him about the complexities of dealing with the native tribes, but those warnings had always seemed distant and theoretical. Now, facing hundreds of armed warriors on his doorstep, Malachi wished he had paid closer attention to those lessons. Around noon, a movement caught his eye. One warrior, taller than the others and wearing an elaborate feathered headdress, dismounted from his horse and began walking toward the cabin. Unlike the others, this man's face wasn't painted for war. His expression was serious but not hostile, and he moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command. Malachi's hand instinctively moved to the rifle hanging above his fireplace, then stopped. 300 warriors against one inexperienced rancher. The weapon would be useless except to ensure his own death. The leader stopped exactly 10 paces from Malachi's front porch and spoke in clear, unaccented English. Malachi Brooks. It wasn't a question. The man knew his name. "Yes, sir," Malachi replied, stepping onto his porch despite his trembling knees. "I am Dakota, chief of the Lakota band that travels these lands. We have come about the woman." Malachi's heart hammered against his ribs. "What woman?" Dakota's eyes narrowed slightly, studying Malachi's face with the intensity of a man reading tracks in difficult terrain. "The woman you sheltered in the storm. The woman who now wears your jacket." The simple words hit Malachi like physical blows. Ayanna was still wearing his jacket, but why would that matter to an entire tribe? "She was cold," Malachi said weakly. "I was just being neighborly." Something flickered across Dakota's weathered features, an expression Malachi couldn't decipher. When the chief spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made the air feel heavier. "Young rancher, do you know who she is?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Malachi stared at Dakota's weathered face, searching for clues he couldn't interpret. The silence stretched between them while 300 warriors waited for his answer to a question he didn't understand. "She said her name was Ayanna," Malachi replied, his voice smaller than he intended. "That's all I know." Dakota's expression darkened. "That is not all you need to know." The chief turned and gestured toward the assembled warriors. "Each of these men would die for her without hesitation. They have ridden for 2 days straight, leaving their families behind, because word reached us that she had been seen with a white rancher, wearing his jacket." Malachi felt the blood drain from his face. "I don't understand. It was just a jacket." "Just a jacket," Dakota repeated, and something in his tone made Malachi's skin crawl. "Tell me, young rancher, what did she do when you offered it to her?" The memory came flooding back with uncomfortable clarity. The way Ayanna had stared at the jacket, as if it were precious. The way she had asked if he would truly give it to her. The intensity in her eyes when she pulled it around her shoulders. She seemed surprised, Malachi admitted, like maybe she wasn't used to kindness from strangers. Dakota nodded slowly. "She is my daughter." The words hit Malachi like a physical blow. The chief's daughter. He had given his jacket to the chief's daughter. No wonder 300 warriors had appeared at his fence. "Sir, I meant no disrespect," Malachi stammered. "I was just trying to help. I didn't know who she was." "That much is clear," Dakota replied. "If you had known, you would never have dared approach her." Malachi's mind raced. Was this about honor? Had he somehow violated their customs by speaking to her? By touching her with his jacket? The possibilities terrified him. "What happens now?" he asked. Dakota studied him for a long moment, his dark eyes seeming to weigh Malachi's soul. "That depends on many things. Why was she alone in the storm? Why did she accept your jacket? And most importantly," the chief's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, "why did she not come home last night?" The last question hit Malachi like cold water. "What do you mean she didn't come home?" "Ayanna left our camp 2 days ago to gather herbs for her grandmother's medicine. She should have returned before the storm. When our scouts found her horse this morning, still wearing your jacket, she was nowhere to be found." Malachi's legs nearly gave out. "You think something happened to her?" "I think," Dakota said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge, "that the last person to see my daughter alive was you." The accusation hung between them like a blade. Malachi could feel the eyes of 300 warriors boring into him, their earlier stillness now feeling less like patience and more like the calm before violence erupts. "She left on her own," Malachi protested. "I offered her my cabin, but she said her people would worry. She walked back into the storm, wearing your jacket." "Yes, but I told her she could keep it until—" Malachi's words died in his throat as he realized what Dakota was really telling him. Ayanna hadn't made it home. She had disappeared somewhere between his ranch and her camp, and he was the last person who had seen her. But there was something else in the chief's eyes, something beyond anger or grief, something that looked almost like hope. "There is one way to prove your innocence, young rancher." Dakota's words sent ice through Malachi's veins. Prove his innocence. The way the chief said it suggested the proof would be neither simple nor safe. What kind of proof? Malachi asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. You will help us find her. The statement was so unexpected that Malachi blinked in confusion. Help you find her? But I don't know anything about tracking or… You know where you last saw her. You know which direction she went. Most importantly, Dakota's eyes hardened. You know why she was running. Running. The word escaped Malachi's lips before he could stop it. Dakota stepped closer, his imposing frame casting a shadow over Malachi despite the noon sun. My daughter is the finest rider in our tribe. Her horse does not spook easily, and she knows these lands better than the wolves that hunt them. For her to be caught in that storm alone and on foot means something drove her from her horse before she reached safety. A chill ran down Malachi's spine as he remembered Ayana's behavior during the storm. The way she had kept glancing over her shoulder toward the tree line, the fear in her eyes that hadn't seemed directed at him, the exhaustion in her movements, as if she had been traveling hard for hours. She seemed scared, Malachi admitted, but not of me. She kept looking behind her toward the woods. Exactly. Dakota's voice carried grim satisfaction. Someone was following her, someone who means her harm, and now she has disappeared between your ranch and our camp, somewhere in those 12 miles of wilderness. The math was brutal in its simplicity. 12 miles of rough terrain, countless hiding spots, and a woman who had vanished without a trace. If she was injured or trapped somewhere, every hour that passed reduced their chances of finding her alive. But why do you need me? Malachi asked. You have 300 men who know this land better than I ever will. Because, Dakota said, whoever took my daughter knows we would search. They will avoid the obvious paths, the places we would look first. But they might not expect a white rancher to be hunting with us. Your presence changes their calculations. Malachi felt the weight of 300 stares pressing down on him. The logic was sound, but it also meant riding into unknown danger with men who still might decide he was responsible for their chief's daughter disappearing. And if we don't find her? He asked. Dakota's expression grew stone cold. Then you will discover why my people have survived on these plains for 1,000 years, while others have not. The threat was clear, but something else worried Malachi more. The way Dakota kept referring to someone taking Ayana, as if her disappearance wasn't random, as if the chief knew more about the danger his daughter faced than he was revealing. Who would want to hurt her? Malachi pressed. For the first time, Dakota hesitated. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that suggested old wounds and complicated histories. There are men who believe taking a chief's daughter would give them power over our tribe. Men who think one woman's suffering is worth the chaos it would bring to our people. Other tribes? Worse, Dakota said grimly. Men from our own band who hunger for leadership they have not earned. The revelation hit Malachi like a physical blow. This wasn't about strangers or outside enemies. This was about betrayal from within Ayana's own people. How do you know? Malachi asked. Dakota's jaw tightened. Because yesterday, before she left camp, 3 young warriors asked permission to court my daughter. I denied them all. The pieces of a darker puzzle began falling into place in Malachi's mind. 3 rejected suitors. A chief's daughter who fled into a storm rather than face whatever was pursuing her. Warriors who might believe that possessing Ayana could somehow transfer Dakota's authority to them. Which 3 men? Malachi asked. Dakota's expression grew even more grim. That is why we need you. White Rancher. I cannot accuse my own warriors without proof. But if one of them has taken Ayana, they will not expect me to ride with a stranger. Your presence will make them careless. The strategy was cunning and dangerous. Use Malachi as an unwitting decoy to flush out potential traitors among Dakota's own men. If the chief was right, one or more of the assembled warriors outside Malachi's fence was complicit in Ayana's disappearance. What if you're wrong? Malachi asked. What if it wasn't someone from your tribe? Then we follow the other trail. What other trail? Dakota pointed toward the distant mountains. 2 days ago, army scouts were seen near our territory, white soldiers looking for something they claimed to have lost. They asked many questions about young native women. Malachi's blood turned to ice water. Army scouts hunting for native women could only mean one thing, and it wasn't anything good. Stories of soldiers taking native women as slaves or worse had reached even his isolated ranch. You think the army took her? I think, Dakota said carefully, that someone wanted us to believe the army took her. But my daughter is too smart and too fast to be caught by clumsy horse soldiers. She would only be taken by someone she trusted. The implication hung between them like a noose. Someone Ayanna trusted had betrayed her. Someone close enough to get near her without raising suspicion. Someone who knew her habits, her routes, her weaknesses. How can I help track someone through country I don't know? Malachi asked. You cannot, but you can watch faces while I track. You can see which of my men seem nervous when we search certain areas. You can notice things an outsider would notice that I, as their chief, might miss. It was a dangerous game Dakota was proposing. Malachi would be riding into hostile territory with men who might be enemies, looking for clues to identify traitors among warriors who could kill him before he could even draw breath to scream. But the alternative was standing by while Ayanna remained missing, possibly dying somewhere in the wilderness while precious hours ticked away. If we find who took her, Malachi asked, what happens then? Dakota's smile was sharp as a blade. Justice. The single word carried more menace than any threat Malachi had ever heard. Whatever justice meant to a Lakota chief, it wouldn't be gentle. When do we leave? Malachi found himself asking. Now. Every moment we delay gives them more time to hide her or, Dakota's voice faltered slightly, to ensure she never speaks of what she has seen. The urgency in the chief's tone told Malachi everything he needed to know about Ayanna's chances if they didn't find her soon. This wasn't just about a missing woman anymore. This was about preventing a murder. I'll get my horse, Malachi said. As he turned toward the stable, Dakota's voice stopped him cold. Bring your rifle, White Rancher, and pray to whatever God you believe in that we find my daughter before nightfall. The chief's words carried a finality that made Malachi's hands shake as he reached for his saddle. Whatever they were riding into, Dakota clearly expected it to end in blood. But as Malachi prepared his horse, one thought kept echoing in his mind. If Ayanna had been taken by someone she trusted, someone from her own tribe, then riding out with Dakota's warriors might not be a rescue mission. It might be riding straight into a trap. Within minutes, Malachi found himself riding alongside Dakota at the head of a column of 50 warriors. The remaining men stayed behind to guard the ranch and watch the surrounding area, but their presence felt more like insurance than protection. Insurance that Malachi wouldn't try to escape if things went badly. The trail started exactly where Malachi remembered seeing Ayanna disappear into the storm. Dakota dismounted and studied the ground with the intensity of a man reading a book written in mud and broken grass. Despite the previous night's rain, he seemed to find signs that Malachi's untrained eyes couldn't detect. She went this way, Dakota announced, pointing toward a rocky outcropping about half a mile from Malachi's fence line. But she was not alone. How can you tell? Her footprints are deep on the left side, shallow on the right. She was favoring her left leg, probably injured. And here, Dakota pointed to a depression in the soft earth. Someone else's boots, larger, walking behind her. The image that formed in Malachi's mind made his stomach clench. Ayanna, hurt and limping, being followed by someone who meant her harm. No wonder she had seemed so frightened during the storm. As they followed the trail deeper into the wilderness, Malachi became aware of tension among the warriors riding with them. Conversations died when he looked in their direction. Several men kept glancing at each other with expressions he couldn't read. The atmosphere felt charged, like the air before lightning strikes. Tell me about the 3 men who asked to court your daughter, Malachi said quietly to Dakota. The chief's jaw tightened. Kitchi rides with us today. He is young, impetuous, believes his hunting skills make him worthy of any woman. Ayanna has made it clear she has no interest in him. Malachi scanned the warriors behind them, but couldn't identify which man might be Kitchi. They all looked formidable and dangerous to his inexperienced eyes. The second is Chayton. He is older, more cunning. He believes marriage to my daughter would give him claim to lead the tribe when I die. Is he here too? He stayed behind to guard your ranch. Dakota's tone suggested that decision had been deliberate. The third is Maddo. He has a violent temper and does not accept rejection well. Before Malachi could ask about Maddo, Dakota suddenly raised his hand, signaling the entire column to halt. The chief dismounted again and examined something on the ground that made his expression darken considerably. What is it? Malachi asked. Blood. The single word sent ice through Malachi's veins. He looked down at the spot Dakota was studying and could barely make out dark stains on the rocks. How much blood? Malachi asked, dreading the answer. Not enough to kill, but enough to weaken. Dakota stood slowly, his eyes scanning the surrounding terrain. The trail splits here. Malachi saw it now. What had been a clear path through the grass suddenly diverged in 3 different directions. One set of tracks led toward the river, another toward the mountains, and a third back toward the area near his ranch. "Which way do we go?" Malachi asked. Before Dakota could answer, one of the warriors behind them spoke up. "Chief, we should split our forces. Cover all 3 trails." Malachi turned to see a young man with intricate tattoos covering his arms. The warrior's suggestion sounded logical, but something in his tone made Malachi uneasy. "That is Kitchi," Dakota murmured, confirming Malachi's suspicion. "It would be faster to search all 3 paths." Kitchi continued. "If she is injured and hiding, we need to find her quickly." Other warriors murmured agreement, but Dakota remained silent for a long moment, studying the split trails with an expression that suggested he was seeing more than just footprints and broken grass. "No," the chief finally said. "We stay together." "But Chief," another warrior protested, "if we delay, if we split up," Dakota interrupted, his voice carrying deadly authority. "Whoever took my daughter will have accomplished exactly what they intended. They want us scattered, confused, chasing shadows while they escape with their prize." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Dakota was all but declaring that one of his own men was responsible for Ayana's disappearance, and that the split trail was a deliberate deception. Malachi watched the faces of the warriors around him, looking for the tells Dakota had described. What he saw made his blood run cold. More than one man looked nervous. But it wasn't the nervousness of concern for their chief's daughter. It was the nervousness of men whose plans had just been exposed. Dakota's decision to keep the group together created an immediate shift in the atmosphere. Malachi could see several warriors exchanging glances that spoke of plans disrupted and timelines thrown into chaos. The chief had essentially declared that he didn't trust his own men, and everyone knew it. "We follow the trail toward the river," Dakota announced. "That path shows the most weight in the tracks. Someone wanted us to think she went toward the mountains or back to the ranch, but the river trail tells the real story." As they rode toward the water, Malachi found himself studying each warrior with new eyes. Kitchi rode near the front, his jaw clenched in what looked like frustration. Behind him, other men whispered among themselves in their native language, their tones urgent and worried. The river, when they reached it, was running high from the previous night's storm. The banks were muddy and torn up, making tracking difficult. Dakota dismounted again and spent long minutes examining the ground, his expression growing increasingly grim. "She crossed here," he finally announced, "but not willingly." "How do you know?" Malachi asked. "The spacing of her steps. Someone was forcing her to move faster than her injury allowed." Dakota's voice carried a rage that made the air feel dangerous. "And there are horse tracks on the other side. Fresh ones." The implication was clear. Whoever had taken Ayana had horses waiting across the river. This wasn't a crime of opportunity or passion. It was planned, organized, coordinated. "Chief," Kitchi called out from upstream, "I found something." Everyone rode toward the young warrior, who was pointing at something caught on a low-hanging branch near the water's edge. Even from a distance, Malachi could see what it was. His jacket, the wool coat he had given Ayana during the storm. "She left it as a sign," Dakota said quietly. "My daughter is clever. She wanted us to know this was the right path." But as they got closer, Malachi noticed something that made his heart sink. The jacket wasn't just caught on the branch, it was tied there, deliberately placed where searchers would find it. And there was something else. "There's a message," Malachi said, pointing to a piece of bark tucked into one of the jacket's pockets. Dakota pulled out the bark carefully. Scratched into its surface in what looked like charcoal were symbols Malachi couldn't read, but their meaning seemed to hit Dakota like a physical blow. "What does it say?" Malachi asked. Dakota's face had gone pale beneath his weathered skin. "It says, 'The daughter pays for the father's crimes. Sunset tomorrow, or she dies.'" The message changed everything. This wasn't about rejected suitors or ambitious warriors seeking power through marriage. This was about revenge against Dakota himself, with Ayana as the weapon. "What crimes?" Malachi asked. "There was a dispute last winter. A warrior from another band claimed I had stolen horses that belonged to his family. When he challenged me to combat, I defeated him, but I spared his life." Dakota's voice carried the weight of regret. "His name was Akacheta. He swore he would have his revenge." "You think he took Ayana?" "I think he has help." Dakota looked around at his assembled warriors with eyes that held both fury and suspicion. Someone told him when my daughter would be traveling alone. Someone gave him information about her roots, her habits. The accusation hung over the group like a storm cloud. One of the warriors riding with them had betrayed their chief's daughter to her enemies. The question was which one? Malachi watched faces again, looking for the tells of guilt or fear. What he saw instead was something worse. Several of the warriors were looking at each other with expressions of recognition, as if they were silently acknowledging something they all knew but hadn't spoken aloud. "There's something else," Malachi said quietly to Dakota. "That message. It gives you until sunset tomorrow. That's more than 24 hours away. Why so long?" Dakota's eyes narrowed as he considered the question. Because Akacheta is not just seeking revenge, he is seeking humiliation. He wants time for word to spread. He wants other tribes to know that the great chief Dakota could not protect his own daughter. Or, Malachi said, a terrible possibility occurring to him, he wants time for you to make a mistake. Time for you to do something desperate that will destroy your authority with your own people. The truth of it hit them both simultaneously. This wasn't just a kidnapping. It was a trap designed to force Dakota into actions that would discredit him as a leader. If he negotiated with Akacheta, he would look weak. If he refused and let Ayana die, he would look heartless. If he attacked and lost warriors in the process, he would look reckless. "What does Akacheta want in return for her release?" Malachi asked. Dakota's smile was sharp and cold. "He has not said yet, but I know what he wants. He wants me to abdicate my position as chief and acknowledge him as the rightful leader of both our bands." The scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear. This wasn't just about one man's revenge. This was about a coup designed to topple Dakota from power and unite two tribes under Akacheta's leadership. But as Malachi processed this revelation, another thought struck him with chilling clarity. If Akacheta needed inside information to plan Ayana's capture, and if several warriors in their group seemed to know more than they were saying, then their rescue mission might actually be leading them straight into an ambush. Malachi's warning about the ambush proved prophetic within the hour. As they followed the trail deeper into a narrow canyon, arrows suddenly whistled from the rocks above, and hostile war cries echoed off the stone walls. Dakota's warriors scattered for cover, but not before Malachi spotted something that made his blood freeze. Kitchi wasn't taking cover with the others. Instead, the young warrior was signaling to the attackers, using hand gestures that were clearly prearranged. The betrayal Dakota had suspected was happening right in front of them. "Dakota!" Malachi shouted over the sound of arrows striking stone. "Kitchi is with them!" The chief's eyes followed Malachi's pointing finger, and his face hardened into a mask of controlled fury. In one fluid motion, Dakota drew his bow and put an arrow through Kitchi's shoulder, dropping the traitor to the canyon floor. The ambush collapsed into chaos as Dakota's loyal warriors realized one of their own had led them into a trap. But the distraction gave Malachi a chance to spot something the others had missed. High up on the canyon wall, partially hidden behind a cluster of boulders, he could see a flash of buckskin that could only be Ayana. "She's up there," Malachi called to Dakota, pointing toward the rocky outcropping. "About 50 yards up the north wall." "Too exposed," Dakota replied, firing an arrow at one of Akacheta's men. "They will kill her before we can reach her." But Malachi was already moving. While the warriors engaged the ambushers in the canyon floor, he slipped away from the main group and began climbing the steep rock face. His soft ranch life hadn't prepared him for this kind of exertion, but desperation gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. The climb took agonizing minutes while the battle raged below. When he finally reached the ledge where he had spotted Ayana, he found her bound and gagged, but alive and conscious. Her eyes widened when she saw him, then filled with relief. "It's going to be all right," he whispered as he cut through her bonds with his knife. "Your father is here." "Malachi!" she gasped as soon as he removed the gag. "It was Kitchi. He told Akacheta where to find me." "I know. Your father figured it out." But even as he helped her to her feet, Malachi could see they weren't safe yet. The ledge they were on was a dead end, with sheer drops on 3 sides. The only way down was the treacherous path he had just climbed, and that would leave them exposed to enemy arrows. That was when Ayana surprised him. Instead of being the helpless captive he expected, she proved to be as resourceful as her father had claimed. She knew a different route down, a hidden path that would bring them out behind Akacheta's position. "Follow me," she said, moving with confidence despite her ordeal. "And stay low." The descent was even more dangerous than the climb up, but Ayana moved like someone who had spent her entire life navigating difficult terrain. When they finally reached the canyon floor, they were positioned perfectly to see Akacheta directing his warriors from a protected position behind a large boulder. "Can you use that rifle?" Ayana asked, pointing to the weapon still strapped across Malachi's back. "Not well," he admitted. "Then give it to me." What happened next would stay with Malachi for the rest of his life. Ayana took his rifle, settled into a shooting position with practiced ease, and put a bullet through Akacheta's thigh, dropping him instantly. The shot was so precise, so unexpected from their position, that it created exactly the confusion Dakota needed to rally his warriors and overwhelm the remaining ambushers. The battle ended as suddenly as it had begun. Akacheta's surviving men surrendered when they realized their leader was wounded, and their advantage was gone. Kichi, bleeding but alive, was taken prisoner, along with 2 other warriors who had been part of the conspiracy. As the dust settled and the immediate danger passed, Malachi found himself standing with Ayana at the center of a group of victorious warriors, all of them looking at him with expressions of newfound respect. "You climbed a canyon wall to save my daughter," Dakota said, approaching them with something that might have been pride in his voice. "That took courage I did not know you possessed." Malachi looked down at his torn clothes and scraped hands, amazed at what desperation and determination had driven him to do. 3 days ago, he had been a lonely rancher who had never kissed a woman or fired a shot in anger. Now he had helped rescue a chief's daughter and exposed a conspiracy that could have destroyed an entire tribe. "Your jacket," Ayana said softly, holding out the wool coat he had given her during the storm. "You should have this back." "Keep it," Malachi replied. "Something tells me you've earned it." She smiled then, the same deep smile she had given him during the storm, and Malachi felt something shift inside him. He was no longer the inexperienced boy who had started this adventure. He was a man who had faced danger and proven himself capable of courage when it mattered most. "You will always be welcome in our camp, Malachi Brooks," Dakota said formally. "Any man brave enough to risk his life for my daughter has earned a place among our warriors." As they rode back toward his ranch with Ayana safe and the traitors in custody, Malachi realized that giving away a simple jacket during a storm had changed his life in ways he never could have imagined. He was no longer alone on his isolated homestead. He had found something worth fighting for, and people who considered him family. The sun was setting as they reached his fence line, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. 200 warriors still waited there, but now they were celebrating instead of threatening. Malachi Brooks, the virgin rancher who had never known adventure or danger, had become someone entirely different. He had become a man worthy of the woman who still wore his jacket with pride. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where courage and destiny collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.